So when I started making garments in CLO, patterning from scratch, designing the garments, so original designs that I printed out and then constructed, I was a little surprised at how they would turn out. The samples wouldn't exactly come out how they were represented in the simulations, and it was essentially because 3D mesh is ultra deceptive. At every step of the way, it's trying to deceive you. It naturally just wants to stretch. Doesn't matter what the material is, if it's had physical properties applied to it, it's going to stretch out unrealistically. So I want to show you some of the tricks that I use in CLO to get a closer to first time right sample. And this is going to be a combination of information from people in the industry, from having made garments myself, and also teaching the class for years. So let me take you into the program and show you some of the things that I use. Okay, so we are here in CLO, and I have an avatar here with a garment that I've brought in. This is a YSL pant that, or Yves Saint Laurent pant with a double pleat in the front and a double dart in the back. And it's women's trousers, so it's got a lot of volume. It's not very fitted, right? And I took this from a real garment, real world garment, and digitized it pretty much. I took the POMs, I traced off, pretty much ripped off the pattern from the existing panels and tested all the cardinal POMs to make sure I had the correct shapes in here. And this is what I'm working with now. So let's start off with this list over here I have in the 3D window with my avatar. And the first and best thing that you can do to ensure that you're going to have the best sample right off the bat, the first try, what they call first time right, is to use trusted blocks. So if you know you have a block that works, let's say it's a button-up shirt, and you change the collar on it, obviously it's going to work. It's going to fit as it always has. If you start to change the sleeve a little bit or the armhole fit, that could mean something else, but ultimately this is the best place to start. If you have a library that you've built up with blocks that you've tested, they're tried and true, this is how big companies do it. It's how you know you're going to get samples without even doing a first iteration. You know production's going to go swimmingly without even testing it first. So that's number one, right? Now let's say you are doing this method of bringing in a pattern, digitizing a real world pattern and bringing it into CLO, and you want to see how it's going to fit on this virtual avatar. Or just freehand drawing a pattern from scratch. This is the list that I go to when I teach class, when I do it myself. This is how I test my patterns so I can get as close as possible to a correct fitting sample. So obviously you want to apply the right size. Maybe that's obvious, maybe it's not. But I put it there for a reason, because sometimes people will start with a default size, and that's ultra small. Then you want to go up to a size 10, maybe use the auto grading feature to get a bigger size, and it doesn't always do it perfectly, so you can't 100% trust that, as you shouldn't. But just start with the right size to begin with. That's going to save you a lot of trouble and a lot of guessing. The next thing is applying the correct fabric. If you know you're going to be making this out of a twill or a gabardine, then put a gabardine on your pant, your patterns. If it's going to be a plain weave, then just use a muslin. That works. Piggybacking on the fabric part, using a base map, what they used to call texture maps, using an image of a grid on top of your fabric is going to allow you to assess things in a more nuanced way. And this is pretty much the grid method of fitting garments. And ultimately, what this is going to do is allow you to target an area of the garment that is either distorted, sloping, pinching, or what have you, the range of fit problems, and it's going to tell you exactly where in the garment it needs to be fixed. So to do that, I'm going to go into my object browser. I'm going to click on the fabric that I have applied to my pant to select it. I need my property editor open for this. And right here, let me move this, right here under base color and color, you have base color map. This is what we want to switch out here for our regular base map. So not just the look of muslin, but we want to put an actual pattern on it. And for this, I made my own, which is a stripe, a vertical stripe for grain line, and then horizontal blocks of color to essentially work like a horizontal balance line, a system of horizontal balance lines. And it looks like this. So you can use PNGs or JPEGs for this. I went with a PNG this time. And here's what it looks like. So vertical grain lines and horizontal rectangles pretty much that will tell you where the garment is sloping. So now you can see how this line is falling, which you refer to as the plumb line of a pant. You want the plumb line or center of the waist to fall down and end in the center of the leg opening, so you know that your leg is balanced, right? Same with the side seam here, which we'll talk about the pitch of the side seam or out seam in a second. But now I can see whether or not this needs to, and if I simulate here, I'll be able to mess with my garment, whether I need to pick this up a little bit or let this drop down a little bit. Okay, so correct fabrication with physical properties applied. I got my grid on here. Now let's go to the next one on the list. Check the 2D measurements on patterns for correlation to avatar measurements. And what I mean by this is literally just using the POM tool or the internal line tool to make measurements at those really important areas like the low hip line and see if that's what your avatar needs right there. If your avatar has a 39.5-inch hip circumference, then that's what your hip needs to be in your patterns, plus a little bit for ease depending on the style of garment or style of pant fit, right? So checking those 2D measurements, going around, making sure that the length is correct for how long you want it to be, the waist is correct for the circumference, hip is right, all that stuff. Okay? So after that, we're going to go to truing patterns in a different way. We want to, other than creating 90-degree corners at center front seam lines where they're going to transition over to the other side, right? Truing your corners. We want to make sure that all of our seams are the exact same length. We don't want a 27-inch outseam for our back panel and then a 29-inch outseam for our front panel. That would cause things to askew and that would give you an incorrect read, right? So a number of ways that you can do this. One way is to use the walk pattern tool, yeah, this one right here. And this allows you to run a pattern along each other and see where they meet. You can also use this to put notches in your patterns, which is really helpful. So if you're in this tool and you're doing this process, you right click at any point and you can choose to add notches. It's grayed out here, so it's really hard to see, but you can add a notch to the walked pattern, the one that came over to the other one, to the stationary pattern, the one that stayed, or both patterns. So I can choose that. And then when I hit enter, both of them would have a little notch there. Super helpful. The other way is to simply use the edit pattern tool to measure what your seam length is. So I have 39.53 on that outseam, and then I have 39.51. So not too far off, a couple of hundredths, but if you want it to be ultra precise, maybe you want to change that. And you can do that by right-clicking and change length. So right-clicking on that segment and changing length, right? Type in the length that you want, make sure it's going in the correct direction, start and or both, right? Look to the preview. It's giving you a little arrowhead on which direction it's going to change it from. So those are a couple of manual ways that you can just go through, run through. You want to go from one direction to the other, not all around, meaning start at center front and work your way to the outseam, then work your way to center back type of thing. Another way that's really quick is this check sewing tool right here. Really helpful. Check sewing length, it's called. When you turn this on, you're going to get this little window right here, and you can type in your tolerances that you want. And ultimately, this is going to tell you where your sewing relations are unequal to each other. Sometimes you want your sewing relations to be unequal to each other. Maybe you're gathering a sleeve head into an armhole, and that would have more material going into a shorter seam. But this is one way for you to check that. And also it gives you your custom tolerances, which is pretty nice. Okay. So the next thing on the list is to check for correct grain lines. What grain do you have your patterns on? And the way you control grain in this program is through print layout. So I'm going to change my work mode over here at the top. I can close up these panels for a minute. Up here in the top right-hand corner, this drop-down menu, normally we work in simulation mode, that's default. And we have all these other modes that we can work in, but print layout will take you to this. And right now, my patterns are not nested, meaning they're not even on the fabric and they are not positioned in a way where they fit together on the fabric. So I'm going to nest my patterns by clicking on this little shirt with a play icon on it. And it tells me that, oh, because of this one, oh, good Lord. That's fine. Okay. This is what I'm concerned with, not the list pattern that I have out there. So now I can see that my grain should be more like this, aligned with this grain that I put on my fabric, right? Now that's not always the case, so you sort of have to take that case by case and figure that out for yourself. But you do need the intended grain for this garment, because otherwise it's going to drape differently, it's going to hug the body differently, all of that. So print layout is how you change the actual grain and how this pattern relates to the grain of the fabric. Print layout, okay? Now, one thing that I noticed I totally forgot to put on this list is to seam tape and bond your pattern pieces. And what that essentially is doing is creating a forced 2D length in an area. So seam taping and bond in CLO is essentially interfacing, right? Seam taping is going to target just the edge of a pattern. So if I select this edge with my edit pattern tool and I go into my property editor, and right under elastic here is seam taping. If I turn that on, and you can choose the width that you want. So if I zoom in here, you'll see this orange overlay. That means there's seam taping applied to this edge, and that's gonna prevent that seam from stretching out. So if you're working with a woven material and that's not supposed to stretch right there, that's a really handy way to get the garment and that particular seam to behave in the way it's supposed to. Another way to do this is bond, and instead of targeting just a seam, you can interface any shape at all. You can do an entire waistband or contour band like this just by selecting the pattern or patterns. And again, in the property editor, you'll see bond skive. Skive is just the opposite of bond, giving it bond being that it gives it integrity and structure. And you can choose the strength of bond that you want. So it pretty much goes from the least strength to the most strength. You can also do this not just by selecting the entire pattern, but you can bond an internal shape. So if I wanted to create an internal shape and pretty much interface this entire area right here, all I would need to do, and I can even go on the outside of this, and maybe I wanted something really weird. I needed a strange shape like this. That also can have bond applied to it, and it just, whatever is inside of that internal shape, that pattern will be bonded or have bond applied to it there. Along those same lines, we're talking about forcing a piece of fabric or area of fabric or a seam to maintain its 2D length, right? We don't want it to stretch out. We're trying to prevent it from stretching out like the 3D mesh wants to do. Another feature in here is elastic that can be used in that same way. So elastic works with the ratio of something. You can also apply ratio or elastic to an entire pattern. But if you wanted to make sure a seam line stayed exactly the length that it is in the 2D pattern, you would select that seam or segment or edge and go in the property editor. And here's elastic. You would turn that on. And when you turn elastic on, the default ratio is going to be 80, meaning that now in the 3D window, that seam length will be 80% of the 2D length. So it's going to elasticize it and scrunch it up to 80% of its length. If I were to type in 100 here, it will do exactly that. Keep it exactly at its 100% 2D length. This is really good for a tank neckline. Let's say it stretches out a little bit when you simulate and you know that fabric, it's a linen, a crispy linen, and it is not meant to stretch out. You're going to put bias binding on it. And this is a way that you could also do it other than seam taping. And just so you know, you can use elastic in the other way too. If you want a lettuce edge effect, you can type in a higher than 100 ratio, like 150, and that segment is going to stretch out in that amount and give you this lettuce edge effect. Pretty cool. Let's go back to simulation. So after checking your grain, material display, or what they call garment rendering style in the 3D window, in our vertical toggle menu over here, we have this little icon that looks like a piece of fabric folded over. I have a couple that I really like to use for fit assessment. One is translucent surface. And if I click on that and I go down here to my avatar, I can even hide my avatar. So Shift A. And one really nice thing about assessing the fit of pants using this transparency is that I can now see the shape of this saddle happening. I can see that there's a little peak happening right here, which means I need to true the shaping of these two J seams and where they intersect at the crotch and inseams. And I can also see, if I bring my avatar back, Shift A again, that where this crotch is in relation to the actual crotch of the avatar. So how pitted is my pant, right? Not just the crotch and inner leg area, but I can see where it's hitting everywhere else too. So the translucent view for your garment rendering display, ultra helpful. The other one in this same section here is random color surface. And this is what I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about the pitch of your outseam, because this randomly assigns a color to each pattern. And what that does is highlights or emphasizes your seam lines. So you're really able to tell where your seam lines are, but what angle they're sitting. So I can tell if this is pitching forward or backward, and if I need to adjust my patterns. So if this seam were all the way over here, then I would need to make adjustments. So everything I'm showing you here also requires you to know some about pattern making and how to make these adjustments, because that would be like a 5-hour-long video if we were to do that. I'll go through all of that. But if you did have that specific problem, you could easily search out that solution and then slowly build your knowledge base on how to do all of this. So assessing the pitch of your seams, that's the random color surface. And then after that, once your build is finished, you've gone through all of these steps, you've checked as much as you can, what you're going to do is go into a higher quality simulation pretty much. So what this means is we're going to lower our particle distance, our PD, to at least 5. And if you don't know what particle distance is, it is what makes up your 3D mesh. And mesh is made up of all these vertices that come together and intersect to then create planes between these vertices. And that's what creates objects and fabric in 3D. When your vertices are further apart, so a higher number, further apart, default is 20, let's say, yeah? So 20 millimeters apart from each other, these vertices of your 3D mesh are. That's creating a pretty chunky, low quality mesh. When you lower that number to 5 millimeters apart, then you're creating a denser mesh, and it becomes a higher quality object, and then shows you a more realistic representation of it. Therefore, draping more realistically, folding more realistically, laying, all that stuff. So higher quality particle distance equals lower number. We're going to take everything down to a 5 And you do that by selecting the patterns. This is pattern specific. Your particle distance is pattern specific. And right now I have 10 on here. This is not the default particle distance. 20 is your default particle distance. And I'm going to take it all the way down to 5 because that's a pretty decent quality for rendering and simulation. And even this, when your patterns become smaller, or not become smaller, but just are smaller, you might even want to go smaller than 5, because here's the thing. If you have an ultra small pattern like a spaghetti strap or something, and the width of your pattern is smaller than even the distance between your particles, your vertices, then it can't even function normally as a tiny pattern because there's no space in the mesh for it to exist really. So I think taking these smaller patterns down is best. So these are at 5. Maybe I'll take them down to 3. Something like a spaghetti strap, I would take down to 1 or even 0.8, I believe is the lowest you can go. Okay, so we have a higher quality particle distance. It's going to drape differently now. So if I press my space bar to simulate, I'm going to start to slowly see these pants shift. And it might not be noticeable. It's happening slowly. And sometimes you have to give your garment just a little zhuzh to let it relax. It almost gets stuck in like a frozen state, I want to say. And you just want to give it a little wake up. Nonetheless, we have our lower PD, which is giving us a higher quality mesh. I can see some sewing line types that I probably need to switch over to turned here with my pleats. That'll make them lay a little flatter. That's for a different video. The other thing, when we want a higher quality simulation here, is to lower the collision thickness, the invisible barrier around our patterns. So when we have this barrier around our patterns, in addition to the barrier on top of the avatar, it's creating a bunch of space, extra bulk that wouldn't normally be there. So that's going to throw your fit assessment way off. So you're going to, reduce your collision thickness, the barrier around the patterns, and you're going to reduce your skin offset, the barrier around the avatar, right? So I would select all of my patterns, boop. And in that same area we were in the property editor messing with particle distance, we would go over to additional thickness collision. Default is 2.5, and this is in millimeters. So what this means is that it's going to half that and distribute half of it on the face of the fabric and the other half on the back of the fabric, because garments need to have a barrier between themselves and the avatar, and they also need to have a barrier between themselves and other layers of garments. So that's why it's split on both sides. I would take that down to 1 and see how that reacts first, because once we get rid of our barrier, then things start colliding in a way that isn't necessarily good. So we want to take it down as much as we can without getting too crazy. Now, the next thing is the avatar's skin offset. So select the avatar somewhere, and in the property editor again, you're going to see skin offset here. Default's 3 millimeters, and this is just on the outside of the avatar. You can't really put anything on the inside of the avatar, so that's why it's just on the outside. maybe we take that down to 0. Take it all the way down. See if that works. You could try 1 also, or 0.5. Maybe that would be something to try if you were having a lot of collision issues. And now when I simulate, I'll zoom in here to this area. And we have a much closer fit here. And you can do all those steps that we just did with creating a higher quality simulation by the high res garment button. And that's right here in your 3D toolbar. So I can long hold on that and see all the related tools that come with it: high res, low res, custom resolution. When I get the high res garment button, you can apply all those settings in your own way if you want to customize it. Otherwise, it has its preset idea of what a high res garment simulation is, and you can just hit OK. However, you want to make note of this simulation quality, because if your computer is struggling already, maybe you don't have a lot of memory or a lot of processing power, then you don't want to go into this fitting accurate. Just keep it at normal. It can cause some crashing issues if your processor is not up to it. So I'm going to cancel out because I already did all of that one by one. And the last thing that we didn't talk about for assessing your fit is using the fit maps that CLO offers you in program. And that's over here in your vertical toggle menu again. And it's right here underneath the garment rendering styles. So fit maps, I see right here. And we have 4 of them available to us. And they all do slightly different things, but it feels sometimes a little bit like they overlap slightly. But let me tell you what they are meant to tell you. Okay, so the strain map, are we on the strain or the stress? No, we're on the stress map. Stress map is showing you, displaying the strain along the seams and in areas of fabric. So the strain is going to try and predict where the most vulnerable areas of your seams and garment are for tearing. So that's strain. And we don't have anything too crazy here. You see by this range of color, red is ultra strenuous, down to blues and the safe zone pretty much. And the other maps use this similar color gauge to assess this. The strain map is showing you areas of the fabric where the fabric itself is experiencing stretch or stress. So same color range right here, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing crazy. And the fit map is my favorite. This is the one I use the most. It's the simplest to read, and it's just straightforward, very straightforward. So the fit map is your overall fit, just your fit quality. And it has 2 colors it uses. It turns your garment white automatically. And then anything that's unwearable is in red, and yellow is getting close. It's tight, but still wearable. The only thing I'll say about this is that it can trick you sometimes if let's say you have a seam that has excess gathered into a smaller seam, like a gathered seam, that stress is going to show up as red here. So if I press my simulation here and just pull this a little bit, do you see how it's turning red where it wasn't earlier? So your sewing relations can sort of trigger this, and just the extra force caused by excess material being forced into a smaller seam line. So keep your eye out for that. Not always doesn't mean it's something's wrong when you see a little bit of red somewhere. And then the last fit map is a pressure map. And when you turn this on, the new style of this is that the garment turns this pretty dang near transparent outline of it. It's very ghosted out. And it's trying to tell you the amount of pressure that the garment is applying to the avatar's body. And it shows up by these tiny little blue points here. And it's very difficult to see. But none of this is unwearable. Again, you see this same red to blue color gauge, and it's all fine. You can see a little bit there. If you had a really tight bodycon dress, you would see blue, maybe even green or yellow all over the place. And if it was way too tight, more than bodycon, then it would be red. So you have fit maps here. All right. So all that said and done, those are the tricks that you sort of use to look out and mitigate for these deceptive cues that 3D mesh is naturally inclined to do. It's very hard to tell if a garment is going to turn out the way the simulation looks. But this will get you to a closer spot. Use this, look up your patterning techniques that you need to fix your fit issues in conjunction with this, and good luck with your garments. This is a really amazing feature or tool, I should say, for makers, people who just like making things, garments particularly, but it expedites your process immensely. So why not use it to its fullest extent? Understand it, be in the program as much as you can, test things out. This is one way to do it, or a few ways, few hacks that you can use to help your process, and I hope it does. All right, I will see you in the next video.